Okay, let's just frame this for a second. Imagine you're a historian and there's a black hole in your knowledge. A huge one. A
Right.
1,000-year gap.
Not just any gap, a gap in our understanding of how the most foundational religious texts of Western civilization were. Well, how they survived.
Exactly. For centuries, the oldest complete versions of the Hebrew Bible we had were the Masoretic texts, and they dated to the 10th century, the 10th century CE.
Which means for a full millennium before that, we were basically flying blind. We had later copies, translations, but the Hebrew source, it was a dark age, textually speaking.
And then almost overnight, that 1,000-year void gets filled. And that's what we're diving into today, the Dead Sea Scrolls.
And this isn't just about finding old documents. This is, you said it before we started, it's like history's greatest shortcut.
It really is. So let's be precise. When we say Dead Sea Scrolls, what exactly are we talking about?
Right, so in the strictest academic sense, we're talking about the Qumran cave scrolls. It's this incredible, just mind-boggling collection of 981 distinct texts.
981.
Ancient Jewish manuscripts. And they give us this perfect snapshot of a forgotten world, dating from roughly the 3rd century BCE.
So well before the time of Jesus.
Oh, absolutely. About
Yeah.
250 years before. And they go all the way up to the 1st century CE, so they bracket this incredibly pivotal period in religious history.
And the location where they were found, I mean, it's just the stuff of legend.
It really is. They were found over about a decade, between late 46 and 1956, in a series of caves. Originally 11, now we know of a 12th.
And these are all clustered around the Dead Sea.
Right, near a place called Ein Feshka, on the northern shore of the Dead Sea in what's now the West Bank. And the critical thing, the thing you have to remember, is that they're right next to this ancient settlement called Qumran.
And that's where the big mystery comes in, right?
That's the million-dollar question that we are definitely going to get to. So, our mission today is to trace that entire story. We're going to start with the, frankly, unbelievable story of their accidental discovery.
Unpack what's actually in them, the different kinds of texts.
Then wade into the fierce, and I mean fierce, academic debates about who wrote them. And finally, bring it into the modern era. The fights over publication, the tragedy of their decay, and the political battle over who actually owns them today.
Okay, so this is where the story stops being about dusty academic timelines and turns into a real adventure story. And the heroes aren't scholars, they're shepherds.
That's what makes it so perfect. The protagonists are 3 Bedouin shepherds. Teenagers, really. Muhammad Edib, his cousin Juma Muhammad, and Khalil Musa.
And the discovery itself between late 1946 and early 1947 is pure chance.
It's the classic anecdote of how history turns on a dime. The story that's been passed down is that they were out in the cliffs just looking for a lost goat.
As one does.
Exactly. And one of them spots an opening to a cave way up high. But it's Muhammad Edib who, depending on the version you hear, was either curious enough or clumsy enough to be the first one to actually get inside. He literally fell into history.
He falls into cave 1, and what's in there?
It's incredible. He finds these tall, cylindrical clay jars, and inside them are the first scrolls. And these weren't just, minor fragments to start.
No, this was the mother lode right out of the gate.
It was. He pulls out the great Isaiah scroll, almost perfectly complete, the Habakkuk commentary, and the community rule. These are some of the most famous and important texts in the entire collection, found on day 1 by accident.
Which leads to the part of the story that just makes every curator and historian on the planet break out in a cold sweat, their early treatment.
Oh, it's terrifying, to put it mildly. They had no idea what they'd found.
Yeah.
So they take these 2,000-year-old manuscripts, the oldest biblical texts in existence,
And do what with them?
and hang them on a tent pole in their camp while they figure out what to do.
On a tent pole.
Yes. And we know for a fact that during this time, the community rule scroll, which was one single document, was actually torn in half, just split right in 2. The 2 pieces were separated for years because of that casual handling.
It's just, wow. It really highlights the gap between what they were and what people thought they were. I understand they tried to sell them at first and were told they were worthless.
That's right. The first dealer they took them to just dismissed them, said they were nothing. So eventually they made their way to a man named Khalil Iskander Shaheen, who was an antiquities dealer and, of all things, a cobbler in Bethlehem.
And he's the one who brokers the first sale.
He is. After a lot of back and forth, they finally agree on a price for 3 of the first scrolls.
And let's just pause on this. The price for these texts, which are now, priceless national treasures insured for staggering amounts, What did they sell for?
7 Jordanian pounds.
7.
7. If you do the math, adjusting for inflation to today, that's somewhere around maybe 400 US dollars.
$394, I looked it up. It's
Well,
unbelievable.
a collection that would redefine an entire field of study. But that tiny transaction, that's what kicked everything into motion. It got the scrolls into hands that could eventually recognize them.
So how does the academic world finally get wind of this? Who was the first person to look at these and say, wait a minute, this is something big?
So the scrolls start to move through this network of dealers and religious figures. And the key moment comes in 1947. A man named Mar Samuel, who was the Syrian metropolitan at St. Mark's Monastery in Jerusalem, he buys 4 of the scrolls.
Okay.
And he shows them to a scholar named John C. Trevor, who was at the American Schools of Oriental Research. And Trevor does something brilliant. He compares the script, the actual style of the Hebrew letters, to the Nash Papyrus.
Which at that time was the oldest biblical manuscript known to exist.
It was the gold standard for antiquity.
Mhm.
And Trevor looked at the scroll and the papyrus and he saw not just a similarity, he saw a style that was clearly just as old, if not older. That was the eureka moment.
That's the confirmation.
That's the moment they knew these were genuinely ancient. The problem, of course, was the timing. This is 1947. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War was about to break out.
So the whole area becomes a conflict zone.
Exactly. Any kind of large-scale, organized archaeological search was impossible. It just put everything on hold.
But eventually the conflict subsides enough for a proper search to begin.
It does. By 1949, the government of Jordan gives the green light for the Arab Legion to go search the area. And that's when Cave 1 is officially rediscovered on January 28, 1949, by a couple of captains.
And that kicks off the first official dig.
Led by 2 giants in the field, Gerald Lancaster Harding and Roland DeVoe. And once the scholars were on the scene, and once the Bedouins realized that these things were actually worth a fortune,
It becomes a race.
it becomes an absolute frenzy. What we call the Qumran cave explosion from 49 to 56. It was a mad dash, the academics versus the Bedouins, to find the next cave.
So what did they start turning up?
Well, Cave 2 was found in 1952. It gave us about 300 fragments from 33 different manuscripts. And importantly, that included bits of non-canonical books like Jubilees and the Wisdom of Sirach, both written in Hebrew, which was a big deal.
And then came Cave 3, which had something totally unique.
Right, just a month later. That's where they found the famous copper scroll. And it's unique because, first, it's not parchment or papyrus. It's literally etched onto copper sheets.
And the content is different, too. It's not a religious text.
Not at all. It's a list of 64 locations where a massive treasure of gold and silver is
Oh, no.
supposedly hidden. It is, for all intents and purposes, a treasure map.
Has anyone ever found the treasure?
No. And scholars are deeply divided on whether it's a real, literal list or if it's some kind of symbolic or allegorical text. It's a complete outlier.
Now, amid this cave explosion, one cave stands out as the big one. Cave 4. Why was that such a gold mine?
Cave 4 is the heart of the collection. And part of the reason is that it was obvious. It's actually 2 smaller man-made caves, 4A and 4B, and you can see them from the Qumran settlement plateau.
So it was easy to find, which probably means it was looted first.
Relentlessly looted. But even so, it was the most productive site by an astronomical margin.
The numbers I've seen are just staggering.
They are 90%. 90% of all the fragments ever found came from Cave 4. We're talking about 15,000 fragments, something like 500 different texts.
500 texts from one location.
It's unbelievable. It had, I think, 10 different copies of the Book of Jubilees. It had religious items like tefillin and mizzo. It was clearly a major repository, whether it was a library or a geniza, a sacred storage site.
So after this massive haul from Cave 4, did things start to slow down?
They did. The last of the original Qumran caves to be found was Cave 11 in 1956, and it had some of the best preserved scrolls of all, including the longest one, the Temple Scroll.
But the story doesn't end in 1956. We're still finding things, right? There was the discovery of Cave 12.
Exactly. In 2017, archaeologists announced they'd found a 12th cave. Now, it was empty of scrolls.
It was a dud.
Not at all, because they found broken storage jars, just like in the other caves. And they found pickaxes from the 1950s. It was the smoking gun that proved there had been widespread looting back in the day, and that there were probably more scrolls out there that were lost to the black market.
And it also proves the practice of storing scrolls was more widespread.
Right, and they did find one piece of rolled-up blank parchment ready to be written on, so it was absolutely a scroll cave.
And then even more recently, the finds in the Cave of Horrors That's a name that gets your attention.
It's a grim name. It comes from the dozens of skeletons of people who were hiding from the Romans that were found there decades ago. But in 2021, archaeologists found new things.
More biblical texts?
Dozens of new fragments. And this is
Yeah.
fascinating. They contain texts from the biblical books of Zechariah and Nahum, but written in Greek.
In Greek.
Yes.
Mm.
And the crucial part is the dating. These are believed to have been hidden much later than the Qumran scrolls, during the Bar Kokhba revolt against Rome, around 130 to 136 CE.
So what does that tell us?
It tells us that hiding sacred texts in these desert caves wasn't a one-off event by one weird community. It was a well-established Jewish tradition, a Geniza practice, used during times of crisis to protect their scriptures. It provides a much broader historical context for everything found at Qumran.
Okay, so we have tens of thousands of fragments pulled out of caves, now sitting in labs. Before we can even read the words, we have to understand what they are physically. What were these things made of to survive for 2 millennia?
Well, their survival is a combination of the materials and that incredibly dry, stable desert climate. But the materials themselves are key. The vast majority, somewhere between 85 and 90%, are parchment.
Which is basically animal skin.
Exactly. Processed animal hide or vellum. Then you have a smaller chunk, maybe 8 to 13%, that's papyrus, which is made from reeds.
And then there's that one oddball.
And then the 1.5% that is the copper scroll, which is, thin sheets of metal, about 99% copper, 1% tin, a completely different category.
And those physical materials, the animal skins, have opened up a whole new field of research thanks to modern tech. I'm talking about DNA analysis.
This is one of the most exciting new frontiers in scrolls research. It's a huge leap forward. For decades, putting the fragments together was like the world's hardest jigsaw puzzle. You'd use paleography.
The handwriting.
Right, trying to match the handwriting style. But DNA analysis goes a layer deeper. Scientists can now extract DNA from the parchment itself.
From the animal it came from.
Precisely. So if you have two fragments and the DNA shows they came from the same individual sheep or goat, you have a very strong indication they belong together. It's a powerful tool for reassembly.
But it also gives us cultural clues, right? It's not just about the puzzle.
That's the really fascinating part. It seems to suggest a kind of hierarchy of texts. The DNA analysis has shown that certain texts, often the ones scholars consider more central or important, tended to be written on the hides of domesticated animals, like goats or calves. Whereas other, perhaps less central texts, were written on the hides of wild animals like gazelles or ibex.
So it's possible the community saw the texts on calfskin as being more, significant, more core to their collection.
That's the implication. It's a remarkable insight into how they might have categorized their own library, an idea we could never have gotten just from reading the words. It comes from the very fabric of the scrolls.
Speaking of what's on the fabric, the ink. How did they write on these things?
The ink is remarkably consistent. All the black ink is what we call carbon black. It's basically soot.
Soot from what?
Most likely from burning olive oil in their lamps. They would collect the soot and then mix it with a binder. It could have been honey, oil, or just water to get the right consistency to use with their reed pens.
And I heard that color was almost never used.
Vanishingly rare. We've only found red ink in 4 instances across the entire collection. 4.
And what was it made of?
It was made from cinnabar, which is mercury sulfide, a difficult and frankly toxic material to work with. The fact that it was used so sparingly tells you something.
That color was reserved for something incredibly special.
Exactly. They were following a very strict scribal tradition. Any deviation from black ink was a major decision.
So once they have the fragments, the very first question has to be, are these real? How did they establish their age?
It was a two-pronged approach initially. First, as we mentioned, was paleography, the study of the handwriting. Scholars like Frank Moore Cross were masters at this. They could look at the shape of a letter, the way a scribe made their stroke, and trace its evolution over time.
And just by looking, they could date them.
They could get a pretty good range. They placed the bulk of the material between about 225 BCE and 50 CE, which was a stunning claim at the time.
But a claim that needed scientific backup.
Absolutely. The scientific slam dunk was radiocarbon dating, C14 dating. This is what blew all the theories about them being medieval forgeries out of the water.
What were the results?
The very first test, back in 1950, was on a piece of the linen wrapping. It came back with a date of 33 CE, plus or minus 200 years. So a huge range, but it firmly placed it in the right period. Later tests have refined that, confirming that most scrolls are from the last couple centuries BCE and the first century CE.
But now even that technology is being superseded. We're in the age of AI.
We are. The problem with C14 is that it's destructive. You have to burn a piece of the manuscript, and it can be imprecise. So now we're seeing this incredible new approach using artificial intelligence to refine the dating.
Tell me about this AI Enoch. I love the name.
It's very appropriate, isn't it?
Ah.
Enoch is a new AI model that doesn't look at chemicals. It looks at handwriting in a way humans can't.
Yeah.
You feed high-resolution images of fragments that have already been securely dated by radiocarbon.
So you train it on known data.
Exactly. It learns the microscopic, subtle tells of a scribe's hand, the pen pressure, the angle of his stroke, things the human eye just glazes over. It creates a digital fingerprint for handwriting from a specific micro-period.
And what is this AI telling us? Is it changing the dates?
It is. In some cases, dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
For example, there's a key fragment of the Book of Daniel. Enoch's analysis dates it to between 230 and 160 BCE. That's a full 60 years earlier than the previous consensus.
Wow, that's a big shift.
It's huge. But what's even more revolutionary is what it's telling us about scribal practices. Scholars used to think of handwriting styles as evolving in a straight line, one style neatly replacing the next.
The Hasmonean style gives way to the Herodian style.
Right. But the AI shows that the date ranges for these styles overlap far more than we thought. The Herodian style seems to start way back in the 2nd century BCE. It means these different styles were being used at the same time.
So it wasn't a clean evolution. It was a more complex, messier picture.
A much messier, more human picture. It complicates our neat little theories, which is what good science does.
So we have the materials, we have the dates. What about the language? What are these texts written in?
It's a linguistic mosaic, which is exactly what you'd expect from that period. The overwhelming majority, about 76 to 79%, is Hebrew, mostly in that familiar square block script.
And the rest.
About 16 to 17% is Aramaic, which was the common spoken language of the region. There are even different dialects of Aramaic. Then you have about 3% in Greek.
Greek, all the way out in the Judean desert.
Yep, which tells you how pervasive Hellenistic culture was. And then you have tiny, tiny traces of texts in the ancient Paleo-Hebrew script, a beautiful but archaic form of writing.
Okay, so let's get to the content. Scholars have this handy 40-30-30 breakdown to understand this massive library. Let's start with the biggest piece, the 40%.
Right, so 40% of the collection is biblical texts. These are copies of the books from the Hebrew scriptures, what Christians call the Old Testament. And this is the part that was the real bombshell.
Because it pushed the clock back 1,000 years.
Instantly. Suddenly, scholars had copies of Isaiah, of Deuteronomy, of Psalms that were a millennium older than anything they had before. It was an unprecedented window into the state of the Bible before it was standardized.
And famously, they found copies of every book of the Hebrew Bible except for one.
That's right. Every single book was found in at least fragmentary form, except for the book of Esther.
We'll have to circle back to why that might be. So that's 40%. What's the next 30%?
The next 30% are deuterocanonical or extra-biblical texts. These are books that were clearly important and widely read in the Second Temple period, but for whatever reason, didn't make the final cut into the official Hebrew canon.
So this is stuff like the Apocrypha.
Exactly. This is where you find the incredible, sprawling apocalyptic visions of the Book of Enoch. You find the Book of Jubilees, which retells Genesis and Exodus with a focus on a very specific solar calendar.
So it's like the B-sides of the Bible, the popular tracks that weren't on the final album.
That's a great way to put it. You have wisdom texts like Tobit and Sirach, extra psalms like Psalm 151. Their presence proves that the idea of a fixed, closed Bible hadn't happened yet. The library was much more fluid and expansive.
Which brings us to the final 30%. And this, to me, is the most fascinating category because these are texts that were completely unknown to history.
This is a real treasure trove for understanding the community itself. 30% are sectarian documents. These are the internal documents, the rule books, the manifestos, the unique beliefs of the group or groups who collected this library.
This is where we get a look inside their heads.
A direct look. You have the community rule, which is basically their constitution. It lays out the rules for joining the group, for sharing property, for their communal meals, how to expel someone. It's incredibly detailed.
And then you have the more apocalyptic stuff.
Oh yeah. You have the War Scroll, which is a literal detailed battle plan for the final cosmic war between the Sons of Light, that's them, and the Sons of Darkness, which is everyone else. It describes military formations, trumpet signals, the types of weapons to be used. It's a manual for the end of the world.
It's just incredible to have that kind of direct insight. Now, among all these texts, there are a few standouts. The celebrity scrolls. We mentioned the Great Isaiah Scroll.
Found in Cave 1, almost perfectly intact.
Yeah.
It's the superstar. A complete book of a major prophet, 1,000 years older than we had before. A miracle of survival.
And then there's the giant of the collection, the Temple Scroll.
The big one, from Cave 11. It's the longest scroll ever found, over 26 feet long, and it was probably even longer originally.
And its content, which is all about how to build and run the ideal Jerusalem temple, it sparked a huge scholarly fight.
It really did. It came down to how important this scroll actually was to the community. The great Israeli scholar Yigael Yadin, he saw it as central. He called it the Torah, according to the Essenes.
Yeah.
He thought it was basically their alternative sixth book of Moses.
Their own special version of the law.
Exactly. But another major scholar, Hartmut Stageman, pushed back hard against that.
What was his argument?
Stageman pointed out something very simple. For a text that's supposedly so central, it's never quoted or even mentioned in any of the other sectarian documents from Qumran. Not once.
So he saw it as just another book they had in their library, not their foundational text.
Precisely. Maybe it was an important book, a respected one, but not the book. And that debate perfectly illustrates how, even with a nearly complete scroll, its actual meaning and function can still be a source of intense disagreement.
So the contents show us what this community was reading, what they valued, but that just leads to the biggest question of all. Who were they? Who are the people who wrote, collected, and painstakingly hid this incredible library?
That is the central, enduring mystery. And it's a question that has fractured Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship for 70 years. Because when you look at the evidence, it's complicated. You have this huge diversity of thought in the texts, from mainstream biblical books to really extreme sectarian rules.
There's a huge diversity of handwriting.
A staggering diversity, which makes the idea of a single, small, isolated group being responsible for all of it difficult. So the field has basically shaken out into three major theories about who these people were.
Okay, let's break them down. Let's start with theory number one, the classic traditional view, the Qumran Essene hypothesis.
This was the consensus view for decades, almost universally accepted until the 1990s. It's the idea that the scrolls were the library of a community of Essenes, a well-known ascetic Jewish sect from that period who lived at that nearby settlement of Khirbet Qumran.
So the monks in the desert theory.
That's the popular version of it, yes. The idea is that this Essene community wrote their own sectarian texts, copied the biblical ones, and then when the Roman armies were invading around 68 CE, they hid their precious library in the caves for safekeeping and fled.
What's the best evidence for this theory? What connects the scrolls to the Essenes at Qumran?
There are really four strong pillars supporting it. The first is textual. The descriptions we have of Essene life from ancient historians, especially Josephus, match up remarkably well with the rules you find in scrolls like the community rule.
Things like sharing property, strict initiation rites.
All of it. The communal lifestyle, the emphasis on purity, that's a very strong correlation. The second pillar is the archaeology at Qumran itself.
Right. What did they find there?
The excavators found a room with plastered benches and tables, which they interpreted as a scriptorium, a room for writing. They also found 2 inkwells there.
The smoking gun, a place where they were physically writing scrolls.
That was the interpretation. They also found numerous mikvah, or Jewish ritual baths, which points to a community obsessed with ritual purity, just as the S were described. And finally, you have a geographical reference from a Roman writer, Pliny the Elder.
What did he say?
Writing just after the war, he describes a community of Essenes living in the desert on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, away from the noxious air. The location he describes is a perfect match for Qumran.
Okay, so that's a pretty compelling case. But then we have theory 2, which is a variation on this theme, the Qumran sectarian idea. It keeps the scrolls at Qumran, but questions if they were strictly Essene.
Right. This theory says, okay, there was definitely a religious sect at Qumran, and they were responsible for the scrolls. But maybe Essene is too broad, or even the wrong label. Maybe they were a specific radical offshoot of the Essenes.
Or in another group entirely.
Or another group. The most prominent version of this theory comes from the scholar Lawrence Schiffman. He argues that the community was led by a group of Zadokite priests.
So Sadducees, or at least a group with Sadducean leadership.
A group with strong Sadducean leanings, yes. And his key piece of evidence is one of the most important sectarian texts we have, a document known by its code, 4Q MMT.
MMT, what is that?
It stands for Misat Ma'az HaTorah, which translates to Some Works of the Law. And it's basically a letter, a legal manifesto from the leader of the Qumran group, probably the figure they call the teacher of righteousness, sent to the religious establishment back in Jerusalem.
And what's in the letter that points to Sadducees?
It lists about 24 points of religious law where the Qumran group disagrees with the Jerusalem priests. And the specific legal positions they take on things like how ritual impurity is transferred through liquids are identical to legal positions later attributed in rabbinic literature to the Sadducees.
Wow, so it's a direct textual link.
It's a very direct link. The letter also promotes a solar calendar for festivals that aligns with Sadducean principles, not Pharisaic ones. So it suggests that this community, whatever you call them, was born out of a priestly Sadducean conflict with the Jerusalem temple authorities.
Which brings us to theory 3. And this one throws the whole Qumran-centered idea out the window. This is the Jerusalem origin theory.
This is the major competing paradigm. It was first proposed by Karl Heinrich Rengstorff and is now most famously championed by Norman Golb. And their argument is simple. The scrolls are not the library of one small fringe desert sect.
They're what, then?
They are the rescued libraries of Jerusalem, plural. The idea is that when the Romans were sacking Jerusalem in 70 CE, priests and scribes grabbed everything they could from the temple library, from other synagogue libraries, from private collections, and fled into the desert to hide them.
And Qumran was just a convenient hiding spot.
Exactly. It's on a major road from Jerusalem down to the desert. It was a known area with lots of caves. It was a desperate act of cultural preservation by the mainstream of Judaism, not the work of a tiny sect.
And their main argument against the Qumran theory is just the sheer scale and diversity of the collection.
That's the core of it. The math just doesn't work for them. Paleographers have identified the handwriting of more than 500 different scribes in the Qumran collection.
500?
How could a tiny, isolated settlement like Qumran, which should probably only support 150, maybe 200 people max, have 500 scribes working there? And why would this tiny, radical sect have so many copies of mainstream biblical texts? It doesn't add up.
So under this theory, what was the settlement at Qumran?
They reinterpret the archaeology completely. They argue it wasn't a monastery, it was a Hasmonean fort, a military outpost, later maybe a pottery production center, the ritual baths, the jars. They argue these are all things you'd find in any normal Jewish settlement of the period.
And the famous scriptorium.
They argue it was most likely a dining hall. The whole sectarian settlement idea, they say, is a myth created to explain the scrolls when it should be the other way around.
And finally, we have to at least touch on theory 4, which you noted is by far the most controversial.
Yeah.
For the Christian origin theories.
Right. These are theories that exist very much on the scholarly fringe, but they get a lot of popular attention because they connect the scrolls directly to early Christianity.
What's the main claim?
The most famous claim was made in the 60s by a Spanish Jesuit named Jose O'Callahan Martinez. He argued that a tiny, tiny scrap of papyrus from Cave 7, known as 7Q5, was actually a fragment of the New Testament, specifically from the Gospel of Mark.
And if that were true, it would be huge.
It would be earth-shattering. It would prove the Gospel of Mark was written and circulating before 70 CE, completely rewriting the timeline of the New Testament. But the fragment is minuscule. It has maybe 5 legible letters on it. The overwhelming, near-unanimous consensus of paleographers is that the identification is just wishful thinking. The math doesn't work.
Are there other Christian theories?
There are. Robert Eisman has famously argued that the figures in the sectarian scrolls, the teacher of righteousness, the wicked priest, are actually coded references to early Christian figures like James, the brother of Jesus, and the Apostle Paul. But again, these theories remain far outside the academic mainstream because the dating, the language, and the historical context just don't line up with the evidence from the scrolls themselves.
So we found the scrolls, we've debated who wrote them, but now the story moves into the 20th century, and it becomes a story of a crisis. The very act of discovering them started a clock ticking on their destruction.
It's the ultimate irony. The same environment that preserved them for 2,000 years, that dry, dark, stable climate, was instantly gone. The moment they were brought out into the light and air, they started to decay rapidly.
What was it about being exposed that was so damaging?
Well, you have moisture, you have oxygen, light. But the biggest problem initially wasn't nature. It was humans. Well-intentioned humans.
The early researchers, what did they do?
The most catastrophic mistake was the widespread use of adhesive tape, Scotch tape.
Wait, they used Scotch tape on 2,000-year-old documents?
They did. In the late 40s and 50s, to try and piece the little fragments together, The chemicals in the tape's adhesive seeped into the parchment, stained it, made it brittle, and in some cases, it literally lifted the ink right off the surface. It was a disaster.
Just a complete, unmitigated disaster. But it gets worse, right? There was a specific event that caused a huge amount of damage all at once.
There was. It was during the Suez Crisis in 1956. For security reasons, the main collection of scrolls, which was in Jerusalem, was moved for safekeeping.
To where?
To the vault of the Ottoman Bank in Amman, Jordan. And a bank vault, is designed to protect money and gold. It's often cool and damp.
The worst possible environment for ancient parchment.
The absolute worst. They were stored there for about a year in these humid conditions. Mildew started to grow on them. The glue on the storage plates they were using began to melt and cause damage. By 1958, an assessment found that some scrolls had lost up to 5% of their text in just that short period. They had darkened so much the ink was becoming illegible.
It's just heartbreaking. So how did they finally stop the bleeding? How do we preserve them today?
Modern science finally caught up. Starting in 1991, the Israel Antiquities Authority, the IAA, created a state-of-the-art conservation lab. Their whole job is to undo the damage of the past.
So they're removing the tape?
Meticulously. They painstakingly removed the old tape, the oils, the salts, all the contaminants, and now the fragments are stored in climate-controlled vaults, in acid-free materials, under conditions that mimic the stability of the caves they came from.
Thank goodness, then, for photography, because we have images of the scrolls from before the worst of that damage occurred.
The photography is the scroll's insurance policy. There was a photographer named Najib Albina who worked from 1952 to 1967. And he used this new technique at the time, infrared photography.
Which lets you see things the naked eye can't.
Exactly. His photos, all 1,750 of them, were taken before that horrible year in the bank vault. In many cases, his infrared plates are the best record we have. They show letters and words that have since faded into oblivion on the actual fragments.
And the imaging technology has only gotten better. NASA got involved at one point.
Yeah, which is just a fantastic crossover. In the 90s, scientists from NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the people who design cameras for Mars rovers, they applied their technology to the scrolls.
What did they use?
They used multispectral imaging. It's a system that takes photos in dozens of different wavelengths of light, far beyond what the human eye can see. And by doing that, they were able to digitally distinguish the carbon-based black ink from the animal hide parchment, making previously unreadable text just pop off the page.
And that all culminates in the big digitization project with Google.
The ultimate act of preservation and access. From 2011 to 2016, the Israel Museum and Google collaborated on this massive project to digitize the major scrolls in unbelievable detail. We're talking 1,200 megapixel images.
So you can zoom in and see the individual fibers of the parchment.
You can. And they did it using special flashes that filter out UV light to prevent any further damage. The result is that now anyone on Earth with an internet connection can study these scrolls in more detail than most scholars could a generation ago.
But that access is a very new thing. For decades, the story of the scrolls wasn't one of open access, but of an academic scandal. A lockdown.
It was a huge controversy. For about 40 years, from the 50s until 1991, access to the majority of the unpublished fragments was controlled by a small, international committee of scholars.
And they just sat on them.
The pace of publication was glacial. They effectively created an academic monopoly. If you weren't on the committee, you couldn't study the texts. Scholars around the world were furious, arguing that this shared human heritage was being held hostage by a tiny group.
So what broke the logjam?
It was a couple of things that happened all at once in 1991. First, the Huntington Library in California revealed that they had a complete set of photographic negatives of all the scrolls, and they announced they were making them available to any qualified scholar.
They just opened the floodgates.
They did. At the same time, some other scholars used computers to reconstruct the unpublished texts from a preliminary concordance and published it themselves. The monopoly was broken. The official committee had no choice but to open up access, which finally led to the complete publication of everything in a massive 40-volume series.
But opening up access created a new kind of legal problem, didn't it? A battle over copyright.
A fascinating and landmark case. It was called Qumran v. Shanks. A scholar named Elisha Qumran had spent more than a decade painstakingly piecing together that MMT scroll we talked about from hundreds of tiny fragments.
And someone published his work without permission.
Herschel Shanks, the editor of Biblical Archaeology Review, published Qumran's reconstructed text. Qumran sued.
But how can you copyright an ancient text? It should be in the public domain.
That was Shanks's argument. But Qumran's argument was more nuanced. He said, I didn't write the original text. but I did the scholarly work of deciphering these illegible scraps and arranging them into a coherent whole. That act of reconstruction is an original creative work.
And the court agreed.
The Israeli Supreme Court agreed with him. They set a major precedent. The ancient text itself is public domain, but a scholar's unique decipherment and reconstruction of a fragmentary text can be protected by copyright. It was a huge victory for the intellectual property rights of scholars.
Okay, so let's get to the big so what question. Why do these scrolls truly matter to people today, outside of academia? Let's talk about their impact on the Bible itself.
This is their most profound legacy. As we said at the top, before the scrolls, our oldest complete Hebrew Bibles were from the 10th century CE. The scrolls instantly push that date back a full 1,000 years to the 2nd century BCE.
1,000 years closer to the original authors.
Exactly. It gave us a window into the Bible's textual history that we never thought we'd have.
And the first big takeaway, the one that made all the headlines, was how remarkably accurate the transmission had been.
It was astounding. One of the early scholars, Miller Burroughs, used the famous example from Isaiah chapter 53. He compared the text in the great Isaiah scroll from Qumran with the Masoretic text from 1,000 years later.
And what did you find?
In 166 words, there were only 17 letters that were different. And most of those were just minor spelling variations, like the difference between color and color. It was a stunning testament to the care and fidelity of the scribal tradition over a millennium.
But that's only half the story, because while some scrolls showed that amazing consistency, others showed the complete opposite. They showed a text that was still in flux.
And this is the deeper, more complex truth that the scrolls revealed. Yes, Isaiah was very stable. But when you look at the Qumran manuscripts of, say, the books of Exodus or Samuel, you see huge differences from the text we know today.
Not just spelling differences.
No, entire paragraphs that are there in one version and missing in another. Different phrasing, different order of events. What the scrolls proved is that in the Second Temple period, there wasn't one single authoritative version of the Old Testament.
There were multiple versions circulating at the same time.
Exactly. It forced scholars to accept that the biblical text was extremely fluid and existed in several different textual traditions right up until it was finally standardized or canonized around 100 CE. The scrolls don't just affirm the Bible. They show us the messy, living process of how it became the Bible.
Now, we mentioned earlier that the Book of Esther is the one book of the Hebrew Bible they didn't find at Qumran. Any theories as to why?
It's a conspicuous absence. There are two main theories. One is theological. The community at Qumran was intensely pious and sectarian, very focused on purity and separation. They may have had a problem with the story of Esther, a Jewish woman marrying a foreign Persian king.
It didn't fit their worldview.
It may have been ideologically objectionable to them. The other theory is liturgical. It has to do with their calendar. The festival of Purim, which is the whole point of the Book of Esther, is not part of the unique solar calendar that the Qumran community followed.
So if they didn't celebrate Purim, they had no need for the book that explains Purim.
Exactly. It was simply irrelevant to their religious life.
Which brings us to the most modern and most politically charged aspect of the scrolls, the fight over who owns them.
Yes, the custody battle. The scrolls have been caught up in geopolitics from the very beginning. Remember, they were found in an area that was controlled by Jordan after the 1948 war. The main collection was housed in a museum in East Jerusalem.
Until 1967.
Until the Six-Day War in 1967. When Israeli forces took control of East Jerusalem, they also took control of the museum and its contents, including the scrolls. They were moved to the Shrine of the Book at the Israel Museum in West Jerusalem, where they are today.
And that's the heart of the current dispute.
It is. Israel claims ownership based on them being the paramount heritage of the Jewish people. They argue they are the rightful custodians. But Jordan and the Palestinian Authority argue that the scrolls were taken illegally from occupied territory, in violation of international law like the 1954 Hague Convention on Cultural Property.
So the scrolls have become a potent symbol in the larger Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
A very potent symbol. And it's worth noting that Jordan does still own a small number of scrolls that were acquired before 1967, which are on display in a museum in Amman. So even the collection itself is physically divided by this conflict.
And as if all that weren't complicated enough, the fame and value of the scrolls have spawned a dark, modern industry, forgeries.
This is a huge problem. Since about 2002, with the price of genuine fragments going into the millions, the black market has been flooded with fakes.
And these forgers are getting good.
Very good. They'll often take a genuine piece of ancient blank parchment or leather and then write on it with modern ink, trying to mimic the ancient script. It takes serious scientific analysis to spot them.
And there was a very public, very embarrassing example of this recently.
There was. The Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. had spent millions acquiring 16 purported Dead Sea Scroll fragments. In 2020, after extensive testing, they had to announce that all 16 of them were modern forgeries.
All of them.
Every single one. It was a massive wake-up call for museums and collectors everywhere. It proves that for any fragment that appears on the market now, you need ironclad provenance and rigorous scientific testing because the incentive to cheat is just too high. Hashtag tag tag outro. So when you step back and you try to sum up the value of all this, it's immense. On one level, they gave us our oldest surviving manuscripts of the Bible, closing that 1,000-year gap and confirming the incredible dedication of ancient scribes.
But it's more than that.
It's so much more. They gave us this direct, unfiltered insight into the diversity and the passion of Jewish life and belief during that critical Second Temple period, the time just before the Bible as we know it was finalized, and just before Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity emerged as distinct movements.
So after all this, what does it mean for you listening to this? You're looking for some kind of certainty in history, and what you find is complexity. You find a sacred scripture that was once extremely fluid. You find half a dozen competing theories about who even wrote it down.
You find priceless texts that were almost destroyed by something as mundane as Scotch tape. And you have this bitter, unresolved political fight over who even gets to call them their own.
So I think that leaves us with a question. Given all this evidence of fluidity, of debate, of human error, and of modern conflict, what does it really mean when even our most sacred and ancient documents are not settled facts but are still living sources of discovery and a fierce argument today?
It means that our understanding of history is never truly final. The documents themselves might be ancient, trapped in time for 2,000 years, but the fight over what they mean, where they came from, and who they belong to, that's a thoroughly modern struggle. And it's one that is constantly reshaping how we think about our own history, our identity, and our faith.